Welcome, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, also known as SIMS, I'm delighted to welcome you all here. I'm Lynn Ransom, and I'm the SIMS Curator of Programs and the organizer of the online lecture series. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Dot Porter, who is the SIMS Curator for Digital Research Services, and Nicholas Herman, the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator of Manuscripts. So today's lecture will be presented by Professor Peter Stokes from the École Pratique des Études in Paris. Marks the end of this fall's online lectures. Many of you may know that the series started during the pandemic as a means to bring scholars and students around the world to our virtual table to share and discuss current research and projects in the field of global manuscript studies at a time when gathering in person was impossible. We're now in our fourth year, and I'm pleased to say this fully online program still seems to be serving this need, bringing in geographically and methodologically diverse audiences to gather in this virtual space. The lecturers have taken us from the Monastery of St. Catherine's at Mount Sinai and the Dunhuang Caves of China to centers of manuscript production in Armenia, as well as the Yucatan Peninsula. We have also heard about new digital tools, technologies, and innovative approaches to manuscript studies that have encouraged us to rethink old questions and ask new ones. All of the lectures have been recorded and are available on the SIMS YouTube channel to view anytime. And there should be some links to that in the chat. We're delighted to be continuing the series this spring, and we'll be announcing the lineup soon. So please keep an eye out, or better yet, sign up for our newsletter to hear more about this series and other SIMS programming. Before we begin, I have one announcement to share. The SIMS journal Manuscript Studies, now entering its 9th year of publication and having just published volume 8, issue 2. Will be, as of January 1st, 2024, available at the Diamond Open Access level. This means that all content from the first volume to the present will be available for free on Project Muse, regardless of your institution's subscription status. Further, authors wishing to publish in manuscript studies will not be required to pay any author processing fees to make your submissions available as open access. For those of you who are dedicated to the material text, we will continue producing a print version, and you can subscribe to receive that via the Pen Press website for the journal. We are excited about this development for the future of the journal, as well as for the field of manuscript studies, and we are grateful to Penn Libraries for supporting this really important initiative. And now I'd like to return to the reason that we're all here, and that is this lecture. We're very excited to welcome Professor Stokes today to speak on a topic of apparently great interest to many people around the world, based on the phenomenal response we've had since announcing the lecture just a month ago. Professor Stokes is a directeur d'études en humanité numérique et computationnelle appliquée à l'étude de l'écrit ancien. Another one of those French titles that just happens to roll off the tongue, but as his website tells us, it translates approximately to research professor in digital and computational humanities applied to historical writing. He's also chargé de mission for the digital humanities at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. Combining his expertise in fields of paleography, digital humanities, and computer science, his research has focused on the theoretical and practical questions around the description and analysis of handwriting, multigraphism, and transversal paleography. Prior to his move to France, Professor Stokes played a leading role in the development of several well-known digital humanities projects in the UK, including the groundbreaking DigiPal project, a tool for online analysis of handwriting that was funded by the European Research Council. Other projects during this time include Exxon, the Doomsday Survey of Southwest England, as well as Models of Authority, Scottish Charters, and the Emergence of Government, 1100 to 1250. In addition to these digital projects, Professor Stokes is also the author of the monograph English Vernacular Minuscule from Ethelred to Canute, circa 990 to circa 1035. which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. In France, Professor Stokes has continued his innovative explorations in the power of computational analysis and now artificial intelligence to take the field of digital paleography in new directions and across cultures. He will be speaking today on the focal point of that work, eScriptorium, and answering the question that we all want to know the answer to, how to transcribe 1 million manuscripts with eScriptorium. Peter, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the extremely generous introduction as well. Just try to share. I hope you now see the full screen view. And yes, and thank you very much for coming as well. And I hope I can live up to the interest in the people who are here. And I see, as one I guess would expect, that there's a range, quite a few familiar names and a range of different backgrounds and interests. So I will try to pitch this at a level that it's interesting and accessible and fits to everyone, but I apologize that for some will be perhaps more some things that you may have heard before. But I hope in any case during the discussion afterwards we can go into this some points in more detail for those that want to do so. So yes, the title is perhaps a little bit cheeky and unfair in the sense that we're not yet, I think, at the point of literally transcribing 1 million manuscripts, but we're getting there very quickly. And for those of you who are familiar with the digital humanities, you'll, I'm sure, recognize that this idea of the 1 million books has been around for quite a while. How to read 1 million books, or as John Unsworth and others wrote, how not to read 1 million books, which is also an important question, I think. And I think this is becoming more and more relevant also for manuscripts as we get to the closer and closer to the point where we really can begin to read 1 million manuscripts, or at least approach that. So yes, as always with these projects, I'm talking today, but this is very much a collaborative work, and others, particularly in the eScriptorium team, some of whom are named on the screen, but there are many, many others, of course, who have contributed as well. And I think one of the interests, and something I'm going to come back to a lot, is the collaborative nature of this work, which is, I think it would really be impossible without it. And that's something is very much going to be a theme as we go through. So the key question then, of course, is what we call HTR, the handwritten text recognition, that is using deep learning, AI as you prefer, for the automatic transcription of manuscripts. Then, of course, leading to the question afterwards of what one does with these automatic transcriptions, which is something I'm going to touch on relatively briefly today, although I think it's an important question, and some others, including those in the audience, have already been doing work there. But just to say briefly, the state of the art in HTR, and by the way, HTR, OCRs, you may be more familiar with in practice, there's not very much difference. It's essentially automatic transcription that we're talking about. But HTR is here. It's already here. It's already working. We already have accuracies of over 99%, at least in some cases, not in all cases, of course. But there's a wide range of different scripts which we can now transcribe. And this is a short selection there of cases that we are already applying eScriptorium and other systems for automatic transcription, and in the right circumstances getting not 100% perfect, but very, very close. Sometimes better even than a good master student through an automatic transcription. So again, this is only in particular cases. If we really want to transcribe 1 million manuscripts, then there are further steps that we need. And a lot of this comes down to a large extent to the training data, in the sense that the systems that we're using, they're machine learning, which means the machine needs to learn. It needs to be taught, and we need to provide it with the necessary data in order to do that. So the results depend very heavily on that. And they can change dramatically from one day to the next. if somebody publishes a new model, a new train system that we can then take and bring and use into the system. But another point that I think receives a lot less attention and is very much part of our interest in eScriptorium is that it's not just the machine learning and the artificial intelligence and so on, but it's also questions like the engineering, how to design the interface so that it works. In particular, as I say, alphabetic horizontal left to right writing, historically speaking, is, I think, a minority. I haven't sat down and counted the amount of material, but a lot of what we do works very well for sort of modern so-called regular alphabetic writing. It becomes much more difficult in historical and particularly a multi-script content. And in fact, even if it doesn't work so well, we can still do interesting things, but that's something else I'll come back to later. So my key point for now is, if you have the training data and if you have a type of a case that fits what's already existing in terms of engineering and interface and so on, then you can get extremely good results. We combine that, of course, with digitization, and I just quickly started putting together some numbers, but we have many hundreds of thousands of manuscripts becoming available in different forms digitally. So just a bit of a list. The Manuscriptorium, I had a quick check. It's about 400,000 manuscripts. To what extent they're fully digitized is another question. Gallica, the French, well, primarily National Library and other collections, have around 180,000 manuscripts. There are also projects such as Midrash, which is a project just starting at my institute, the École Pratique, in collaboration with some institutes in Israel in particular, which are working on the essentially complete set of all surviving Hebrew medieval manuscripts. And we're at the stage now where we really can talk about these sorts of numbers, that more or less everything that exists for this particular corpus of around 60,000 Hebrew manuscripts, plus many hundreds of thousands of fragments. The Biblissima project, which I'm involved in, 90,000 manuscripts already available in terms of digitized images there that can be harvested and used. Vatican aiming at 80,000 manuscripts, plus many other corpora as well. So we have these images that are available and that are becoming available very quickly. We have the large scale machine learning, others that are starting to be able to transcribe all this material. And of course, the question is, how can we put this together? How can we start making this work in practice? Or how can we make it work even more, I should say, and what's missing in order to get there? So to address that question, yes, I'm going to talk primarily about the case of Kraken eScriptorium, which the project's led by, well, I'm the co-director with my colleague, but with many other contributors. So I'm going to present a little bit those particular pieces of software that exist and are running today. There are, of course, other systems. Transcribe is one of the most important, which many of you, I'm sure, know and have used, and numerous other ones as well. So although my focus will be on eScriptorium, the principles certainly apply across, and there are questions and themes that will come back there as well. So to answer the question, what can we do with this and how can we potentially try to transcribe 1 million manuscripts? Let me start with a brief explanation of eScriptorium and Kraken behind it. Again, we tend to talk about eScriptorium. I think it's useful to be clear that there are in fact two different software packages, one we call Kraken and one eScriptorium. Kraken is, if you like, the artificial intelligence bit. It's the piece that actually does the HTR, the automatic transcription, and it's something that runs through a command line that's written in Python by my colleague Ben Kiesling. And to be honest, it requires at least some expertise in using tools and online commands and so on and so forth. So that's the bit that sort of does the work, if you like, behind the scenes. But we're very much aware that that's not for everybody. And in practice, and in fact for everybody, when we're generating material to train the machine, we need a web interface. And so this is the key to eScriptorium, which is the front part, the interface that allows us to work with Kraken without needing to know Python and command lines and other parts behind that. I emphasize that both of them are free and open source and fully open in the sense that you can right now go online, get the software, get all the code, download it, install it, and modify it if you're so inclined to run on your system for the software, but also the models. And by the models here, what I mean is the brain, if you like, of the artificial intelligence, the thing that's trained to actually read the manuscripts, do the transcription. That also is something that can be exported and shared freely available. And again, the principle here is these need to be useful and usable for the humanities, which means, as I said, good algorithms and good engineering. So very quickly, the website of Kraken, again, I can send you the links and so on afterwards. You can find this relatively easily. Kraken has been available for a while to install. And as you can see, it's particularly optimized for historical and particularly, but not exclusively by any means, non-Latin script material. Again, we certainly use it for Latin script and others as well. And then there's various technical details on how it can be installed. eScriptorium, again, this is the code where you can go and see it, but there are sites for which give more information about how it works and documentation and so forth. But to go a little more back to the practice, for those of you who are not familiar with how this works, let me explain a little bit the process. So the assumption is you have your manuscripts that you want to transcribe. The assumption is that these manuscripts are already digitized. You already have the images available, which of course is not necessarily given, but you need to get those images and import them into the system, bring them in so that the engine can do the automated transcription. In practice, you need to find these trained models. That is, you need to find a sort of artificial brain, if you like, the trained part of the system that has learnt how to read your particular type of manuscript. And this is, of course, an important point that is going to keep coming back, but it's essential to have a system already trained on something that's close enough, at least, to what you want to read and work with. And in general, we have two, one for what we call segmentation and one for recognition. So the segmentation part is essentially taking the image and finding where the text is on that and other regions as well. So this might be columns of text, it might be decoration, it might be running titles, it might be page numbers, it might be all manner of things depending on your particular manuscripts, or printed books, by the way. This all works for print as well. So you take your system, you put it into eScriptorium, say, and hopefully you can automatically detect the lines and so on. If not, then you can also do it by hand. What is more likely is that it may not be perfectly attuned to your case, so you can correct any errors and then retrain the system so that it performs better on your particular material, and if necessary, repeat this until you get a good result. Then you do much the same thing for the transcription. So perhaps to begin with, you may need to do it by hand. Hopefully you have a model that will work at least relatively well. Or maybe you already have a text somewhere that exists already. If it's a very standard text, you may well have another transcription that you can import and match and perhaps adjust to suit your particular manuscript. And then again, you may need to correct, retrain the model and repeat. It is possible in eScriptorium and some other systems to add a little bit of markup if you're looking to produce an edition, with TEI or something similar. But that's not the key purpose here. The assumption normally is that you'll produce a transcription and then you'll export it to do your study, produce your edition, do whatever it is that you want to do with it afterwards. And at least in the case of eScriptorium, also export and publish your trained models so that other people can take them and use them, put them into practice themselves. What does this look like quickly? Just to give a bit of an example, importing images. So this is not eScriptorium. This is one part of the Biblissima project, where, as I mentioned, there's about 90,000 manuscripts digitized. So you can go to Biblissima, find what you're interested in, and you can take your AAAF symbol there, take that, drag it into your eScriptorium interface, and it will bring all the images in for you to work on directly. So it communicates essentially directly between the BNF and your eScriptorium server. You can find models, for instance, on Zenodo, which, if you're familiar, it's essentially a repository for scientific data, scientific in the sense of academic data. And there is a collection of models that have been published by other people, including just recently another medieval Latin model, which you can take, download into your system and use to do your automatic transcription. In eScriptorium, here's just one example of many. So you have obviously a Latin manuscript in 4 columns. I think it is Latin, but anyway, a Latin alphabet. And here, the different regions that one might choose to annotate either manually or automatically in the system. The labels here, by the way, depend on the project. They can be customized because, of course, it's not possible for us to decide all possible labels in all possible books, systems, and so on. So far, this is relatively straightforward. Of course, once we start looking into a wider range of materials, things start getting more complicated. Just to show you here, a Chinese printed book, where the layout is obviously very different to the Latin manuscript that we were just looking at. And this is, again, a theme that will keep coming up as I go through this, that one of the biggest challenges, perhaps, is not so much the AI and the machine learning and so on, but the range of different material that we start to come across if we're looking really at hundreds of thousands, millions of books across different languages, different scripts, and so on. So in eScriptorium, that's in principle, that's not a problem. The interface can handle top to bottom script, fully rotated script, different angles and directions, non-alphabetic writing. This is all entirely feasible. Once we've annotated, found the text, the layout, and so on, then we can start looking at transcription. So here, just to show a Syriac example, again, the screenshot from eScriptorium, where this could be an automatic transcription that we're correcting, or it could be one that we're entering as we go, as I say, in this particular case in Syriac, to train something to read this style of material. Another example here, taking Old Javanese, and in this case, transcribing it into Latin alphabet. This probably is too challenging to be used for an automatic transcription, but in this case, it was a doctoral student who found it very useful anyway, even for manual transcription, just as an interface to export later. But once that's done, you can then do your automatic transcription. So you have your training data prepared, your example material that you use to train the system, and then you can start doing your automatic transcription. And this, of course, is where you can start applying your model, your segmentation, and your transcription to essentially as many pages as you like. So potentially tens of thousands, if not millions of different pages. And then in the end, once you have your results, you can take it and export it into different formats. So for the moment, the key formats that are available in eScriptorium, text, page, and alto, which are aligned, which are essentially standards for the text connected to the image. And again, I'll come back to why that particular selection and some of the challenges that are around that as well. And then in the end, again, once you have your trained models, these are the systems that are trained for different scripts. In this case, even trained for different specific manuscripts, which is probably not ideal, but as you can see from the list, it gets very good results. So the idea here is to take a model that has been trained in general. I think this one was for Hebrew, looking at it, and then was specifically trained to focus on particular manuscripts in order to get to improve the results up to 97, 98, 99% accuracy. So it's a very, very quick overview of the process of automatic transcription for those of you who aren't familiar with it. And as I say, this is more or less standard across different systems. The key points with eScriptorium think that it is possible to import and export models and that it is intended to be used for a relatively wide range of scripts and so on. So briefly, how do we do this in practice? And in particular, how can you do this yourself? Just to mention that, as I said, and it's important to emphasize, that Kraken and eScriptorium are software and not services. So what I mean by that is this is not a single website where anyone can go and create an account and use it. It's something that you can take and set up your own web server system and get it up and running. So I know there are over a dozen or so different instances, different groups who have set up Kraken and eScriptorium and who may well be accessible to you if you want to use it. Otherwise, in principle, not in principle, in practice, you can download it and use it yourself. However, just to be clear, this is not really something that anyone can just stick on a laptop and run in their spare time. So particularly if you want to transcribe 1 million manuscripts, as you can imagine, this requires fairly serious computing power. It requires really GPUs. These are dedicated systems for training AI. Even though GPUs are becoming more and more common, and the computer I have on my desk actually has a GPU built into it, even though it's just a laptop. But again, if you want to do this in any sort of large scale, you do need the expertise and the system set up to run. So this is for a couple of reasons. One, because we in Paris don't have the resources to support everybody, but also we don't want you to be locked into our system. If in the future we can't continue or we need to start charging money or whatever, you are not locked in. You can go and have your own system. You can change the software yourself if you want, as opposed to some other services where you have to pay to use the site, but the site is there for you. You don't need to worry about maintaining it and so on. So as I say, it's important to emphasize there's always a cost. Of course, in the case of eScriptorium Kraken, the cost is in the servers, which need to be set up and run and maintained by somebody. But the software itself is free and open. So I'm really emphasizing that point because there's often misunderstandings and people thinking that you can just go and create an account and log in and use it. Unfortunately, it's a bit more complicated than that. But just to give a very, very quick overview of some small selection of users, there are quite a number already, and again, there are many more. One of the interesting things, of course, with free and open software is that we don't know everybody who's using it because anyone can just do it. And so, of course, we are interested. We try to keep track, and particularly if somebody comes to us and says, I would like to use it, what can I do? Then, of course, it's useful for us to know, well, you're from this institution, therefore this is the person you could talk to. But again, it's in a sense, it's unfortunate, but it's a consequence of the fact that it is fully free and open, that we can't fully keep track of all of this ourselves. So again, there's a selection there. It's true that a lot of users are based in France, but certainly not exclusively, and it's spreading more and more from there. So that's a quick overview of eScriptorium, how it's how it's, well, very, very quick view of how it's run. If there's time and if you're interested at the end, we can look at some examples, and there are some videos and others online as well, and more documentation to help use it. But for the remaining time, I want to come back a little bit to the question of how to read 1,000,000 manuscripts, and to think about what's needed and where some of the difficulties are in getting to that. Because I think people, and probably myself included and others, it's quite easy to say, you know, we're there, the technology's in place and so on. But the reality is a little bit more complicated, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that. So if you're really going to read 1,000,000 manuscripts, first of all, it needs to be fully automated. And this is something we're discussing a lot with Midrash, even 60,000 manuscripts. There can't be somebody who has to go in and correct even one line per page for several million pages. That's not feasible anymore. So it has to be a process that, if we're getting to that point, really doesn't have much user interface as such. There can't be that particular intervention. So what we have at the moment works extremely well for a few manuscripts. And if you're interested in particular manuscripts, then yes, that's the main use case at the moment. But the process would need to be more fully automated. But I think there's also a question: what do we mean when we say we want to read 1,000,000 manuscripts, even transcribe 1,000,000 manuscripts? And if you're not familiar with John Unsworth and others, their discussion of how not to read 1,000,000 books, I would strongly recommend you go and have a look at it. It's relatively old now, but I think the questions still remain. Things like that we should not be looking at the computer to give us answers. We should not be expecting to just put in 1,000,000 books and have something, a solution pop out the other end. That's really not feasible and not the right idea. That what's much more interesting is using this material to pose questions, to find exceptions, to look in interesting directions. And again, I know there are a number of people in the audience who are doing this already. Certainly, we need a lot more training data to do that. We need a lot more computing power. We probably need automatic model selection. It's basically, as I was saying, you need to be able to choose which model is best suited to your material. That's not going to work with 1,000,000 books. But again, and the two last things are the ones that I want to talk about the most for the 20 minutes or so that's left, which is, if we are really going to do this, and I think as we are already doing now, I think we need to be able to combine our data, our models, our key computing resources, because I can't produce training data for all of Latin, let alone for all different writing systems. No one person can do that. And the more we share and put together, combine our resources, the more progress we see and the more success, I think. And this is part of the reason why eScriptorium, among others, but also AI in general, I think, is really taking off now, because the volume of data available is becoming exponentially greater, as well, of course, as the power of the computers. But this then means ways to manage highly heterogeneous material. And this, again, is really a key challenge, particularly for the eScriptorium project. Now, my impression, I think, from the audience is that the vast majority of you, of us, of me as well, we work primarily with Latin script and Latin material. But one of the many interesting things about being in Paris is that my colleagues work on a huge range of different materials. And in fact, eScriptorium was born in the Scriptor project. And this is just a very small selection of some of the sorts of scripts that my colleagues are working in. And in principle, a selection of scripts for which eScriptorium should work. I'm not claiming that it will in all cases, but this is a start of the list. And that immediately raises all sorts of challenges, yes, but also limitations. Because something that might work very well for medieval Latin, for instance, Latin for us is, yes, it's an important case, but it's only one of many. So if it only works for Latin and not for anything else, then it's not something we can really feasibly add in. And this, of course, has implications for what works and what doesn't, what we can and can't do. So what does this mean in practice? Well, if you're working with so-called rare and historical scripts, do you even have all of your characters available on a keyboard? Almost certainly not. In Unicode, maybe, if you're lucky, but all the different alphabets, all the different punctuation signs, all the different logograms, hieroglyphs, encoding Egyptian hieroglyphs, including cuneiform, including pre-imperial Chinese. All of these, just getting them into the computer is already extremely difficult, not to mention fonts for displaying them that will work across all different systems. Writing direction is a nightmare, I can tell you. People say that it's a solved problem. There is the Unicode bidirectional algorithm and others. It's much, much more complicated than that in practice. Not to mention, the vast majority of systems assume that writing is on a baseline, but that's not true for all writing systems. Some are from a top line, some are verticals, on a vertical line, some are in columns. And then we start on how do we transcribe, how do we publish, how are we going to agree on material? Because if this is about automatic transcription, and we want to share and train the models to produce transcription, that means we have to agree on what transcription we want. And this is by no means straightforward. So again, the so-called simple example of writing direction, Latin, yes, left to right, top to bottom on a baseline. Hebrew, right to left, then top to bottom, but on a top line. Other scripts might be right to left columns, where the columns themselves read top to bottom. But there are also bottom to top that exists, or clockwise, and all sorts of other possibilities. My particular favorite, as always, is this bilingual Hebrew-Chinese manuscript. People who say writing direction is a solved problem have not seen this manuscript, I can tell you. The Chinese is sometimes right to left and sometimes top to bottom. The Hebrew is consistently right to left. Trying to deal with this, trying to train an artificial intelligence to read this is actually not that difficult. What is much more difficult is training an interface that allows a person to see this and have the text displayed in the right way and so forth. That's what's even harder. And just to show you another example here in Arabic, this is a very standard layout, well, a very common layout, at least in Arabic, and the interface needs to deal with that. So we say Arabic is written from right to left, but here, in a sense, it's not, because the writing is rotated. It's more or less upside down. So relative to the orientation of the page, it's going more left to right than it is right to left. In other words, it's starting here and going this way. And then here it starts here and goes this way. And so again, a computer can be trained to do this without too much trouble. What's much more difficult is developing an interface that can allow you to navigate, to see the script the right way up, to type in the corrections and so on, and handle that. That's the challenge in that sense. And this again is a video from eScriptorium, as I'm sure you've realized, where we had to spend a lot of effort developing this in a way that is usable. Because again, for us, this is not some obscure case. This is in fact relatively common that we need to deal with. So again, I'm talking a million books now. Once we start looking at a million books through different writing systems, different languages, different cultures, it becomes all the more complicated. Another challenge that needs to be allowed for is, I mentioned export and interchange and so on. So yes, it's easy to say, eScriptorium allows for import and export of trained models. So I've got a little bit out of sequence here actually, but anyway. And I mentioned that this is an alto and page and so forth. So one of the questions, one of the obvious questions is why alto and page? Why not TEI, for instance? Because we have our transcription. In many cases, we want to be able to export into TEI. Why can't we do that? Well, this may sound slightly strange, but actually it cannot be done, I claim. And let me explain a little bit what I mean. When we talk about text, it's very important to understand that text means many different things. And when we're doing a transcription, what we're really doing is producing text in this sense, somewhere over here. Text as document in the sense of text aligned to, arranged according to an image, that is the image of the page. But when we're doing an edition, what we normally want and what we normally mean is text according to its sort of semantic structure, its paragraphs and chapters and divisions and so on. And these are not the same thing, but not only they're not the same thing, in general, for all different writing systems, all different manuscript types, all different layouts, all different structures, there is no way of getting from one directly to the other. So again, yes, there's TI documentary model. For those of you who know the TI, of course, that's possible. That's more or less the same as Alto, in fact, and converting between the two is extremely easy. But to get to a structured TI in the textual sense of paragraphs and chapters and so on, this actually isn't even an option. There isn't a general way of doing it. How do you deal with marginal notes and page numbers and running headings? And how do you do this in Tibetan and Chinese and Latin and Old Vietnamese inscriptions and everything else? So this is one case where things are going to, another theme that's going to come up is that there isn't a solution maybe in terms of eScriptorium, but there are specific cases where the community of people working in Chinese printed books, for instance, can produce a solution that works for them. And people working on Carolingian Latin manuscripts can produce one or maybe a few solutions that work for them. And so this is a partial answer to addressing millions of books, millions of manuscripts, that rather than one single click the button and have a solution at the end, it probably means more of a combination of different approaches and different resources. And again, the colleagues who are doing this is just one example on complex layout of Hebrew manuscripts being converted into TEI. But there's another question, which is also really fundamental here, and which I've already alluded to, namely, if we're going to export, import, and share transcriptions, that means we need to have shared standards for transcriptions. We need to have a shared model of what we are actually transcribing. And again, there's sometimes a view that a transcription is a simple objective fact. I strongly disagree, and I'm very happy to discuss this in the questions. There isn't really time now, but I think, just to give a very simple example, how do you deal with abbreviations? How do you deal with spacing, deal with punctuation, all these sorts of questions? And as we know, there are different standards that answer these questions, at least to some extent. But that means, again, agreeing. If we're going to share our data, if we're going to transcribe 1 million manuscripts, how do we want to transcribe it? Which standards do we want to use? In theory, it's relatively easy to agree, to decide, to agree, maybe not so easy. And there are initiatives around this as well. There are a few other questions that are specific to or to HTR, to automatic transcription. For instance, if we wanted to transcribe specific signs that maybe don't exist as normal letters, for instance, punctuation, abbreviations, and so on. Here we just need to be a little bit careful. For instance, one sign that can look, or different signs, in fact, that can look the same, might have very different meanings. And we need also to agree that if we want to transcribe a vertical line, which different vertical lines do we actually mean? The circle even more so. And what exactly is it that we're using here? It's not even clear, by the way, that this is a Hebrew word. It could even be seen in some geometric form out of context. So again, if you're writing in Latin, that's fine. That's relatively straightforward. But there are people who would like here, for instance, to start reproducing the forms of letters. And here we can get very quickly into using characters that maybe don't have the meaning that was intended and getting into trouble there. It becomes even more complicated with diacritics. As some of you may know, for at least a set of letters, there are two different ways of encoding the same letter for a computer. So either E with acute accent is one character, or E plus an acute accent. For the computer, these are entirely different things. So if you train it with one and then ask it to do the other, it will not be able to do it. It will start getting confused between them and so forth. Again, this is relatively easy to address, but it's another detail that we need to decide on for sharing data. So there are initiatives that I mentioned, just to cite a couple. Again, these are primarily French ones because they're the ones I'm primarily connected to, but there are others. HDR United, for instance, gathering HDR and OCR transcriptions of all periods and styles of writing, mostly, but certainly not exclusively French. And then they have standards and tools as well, things that can help you check that your data is consistent with what's already there, which of course is essential in all of this. There are people are starting to produce controlled vocabularies. So if you want to label your running titles, how do you do it in a way that this can be shared and used by other people? If you want to label your musical sections, your paragraphs, and so on and so forth, then how can we do this? But it gets, again, it's complicated. Even the standards, the established standards, are not easy to follow. AAAF is changing. There are already some AAAF instances that don't work on eScriptorium because of different interpretations or implementations or versions of the standard. Alto, there are many different versions that are active. Even in 2014, there are 3 different versions, and there are differences in interpretations of the standards as well. So even when there is a standard in place, how we use it is not necessarily straightforward. And even then, things like writing direction, baseline, and so on, these are not yet either. So if you want to transcribe a million manuscripts, we're going to need to be able to decide what standards we use, how we want to transcribe it, why we want to transcribe it. And I suspect this then makes it actually quite difficult to share because my transcription may not be the same as yours. It may not suit the same needs even. So again, I think even though transcription is theoretically straightforward and objective, in practice, it's very much not always the case. So the approach in eScriptorium, in that sense, our philosophy, if you like, is that we can't meet anyone's needs. I'm not sure anybody can, but we are aiming to try to be flexible, make it as easy as possible to get things in and out, to be able to create your own external tools that plug in if it's something that works for you, that maybe doesn't work for everybody, and that as much as possible we can encourage openness, sharing, reuse, software of scripts, tools, data, good practice, and so on. And we're finding that this is really taking off actually with all the different contributors. And again, just to give a small list of different concrete examples, so Yalta, which works much better than the existing segmentation. It's for detecting regions and so on. But it only works if your regions are nice and rectangular and horizontal. Now, for many, many people, that's true. And that's great. So you can take Yalta and you can use it as part of a workflow with Kraken and eScriptorium and so on. There are systems for aligning text and image. For Chinese, a doctoral student implemented transformers, which is another approach which requires very, very large amounts of training data. It's not appropriate for many historical writing systems, but it does work for Chinese, and he's done that as well. Post-processing language models, semiotic markup, conversions, and so on. These are all different things that can be plugged into eScriptorium or Kraken, so on. if the system is sufficiently open and flexible and allows these sort of communications. So that's sort of our approach to do that, to not have a single box, but to be able to construct a workflow. And to do this on 1 million manuscripts is not going to be straightforward, but it's not so difficult to be able to automatically analyze and say this manuscript will work well, sorry, with this particular approach and this with another, and so on. But to finish, and again, I'm aware I'm going in different directions, but I hope this will lead to discussion and questions afterwards. The vast majority of users are assuming that you have to have 99, 100% accuracy. And the vast majority of users, I think, are still thinking in terms of producing an edition at the end. But I'm really not sure that's certainly not the only, and not even necessarily the best use here. And I just want to sort of throw out other ideas that far fewer people are doing. Some are in the audience. And I think this is actually where the real interest is for me, is not just to transcribe, to say, what else can we do? Particularly if we don't have 99% accuracy. Maybe you only have 80, maybe you only have 60% accuracy. We can still do interesting things when we have 60,000, 100,000, 1 million manuscripts. So automatic layout analysis works relatively well now. So we can do all sorts of things with large-scale analysis, looking at number of columns, decoration, layout, running headings, page numbers, and so on. A lot of these things, of course, have been studied already, but to do them at scale across different writing systems, different corpora that have not been studied, which pages or parts of text are more heavily glossed. And there's some projects starting to look at that, and this getting to the point where you can do that now relatively easily, actually. Do a rough transcription, do an analysis of the page layout to find the glosses, see where there's certain texts, there's certain parts of the manuscript. Is it the start of a codicological unit, for instance? All sorts of things here. Language and script detection is starting to work. Again, there are people here who have done work on this, and this can be done more at scale. Automatic text identification. There's software for text reuse detection where you can have quite a lot of errors in the automatic transcription, but it's enough to be able to say, this is a passage from this text. This is a citation from here. Again, for large corpora that have not been studied, this is becoming feasible. Text image alignment for training data, but also for paleographical analysis. And find me all the letters in a given linguistic context. Let me see their forms. Where you need to be much more careful using this for so-called distant reading and stylometry and so on. And I'm sure many of you know there was a case, it's about 10 years or so ago now, where a group claimed to have invented a whole new field, which in fact had existed for decades, through large-scale analysis with Google Books. And there were all sorts of problems, amongst other things, because they weren't thinking about OCR errors and the biases and problems that introduced. But it can be done if you're careful. So yes, HDR for precise, high quality transcription, but for 1 million books, that's still a very long way off. But other uses, again, coming back to the question posed by Unsworth and others, how to read 1 million books, how not to read 1 million books, what to do with HDR analysis or layout analysis of 1 million manuscripts, I think is an interesting and in some ways even more interesting question than simply transcribing. So that's where we are. That's sort of a partial view, at least, of the state of the art in HDR and manuscripts, that particular part of manuscript studies. There are some links, which again, in terms you'll have on the video, so you can come back to. I'll skip over that relatively quickly for now, but just to say there are a number of tutorials and blogs and other discussions around CRUC and eScriptorium. But of course, as I mentioned, there are other tools as well. We have an active Gitter channel, and of course, you can contact me directly. So I will stop there. Thanking you and thanking of course, the financial supporters and collaborators and others. and I'm very happy to take your questions. So.
Wow. Thank you so much, Peter, for this really excellent overview of the nuts and bolts of eScriptorium and the really impressive work that your team has been doing. And while I take your point that eScriptorium is not a service, it's a software, the work that you're doing certainly is providing a great service to the field. So thank you for that. I imagine there are tons of questions. I have a lot of questions in my head. I think while people are gathering thoughts to ask a question, I'd like to go ahead and start with one, which is something that you talked a lot about, and that's the training models. And I'm just sort of curious, how this works. So a training model is produced from a transcription of a particular text, a particular manuscript, and then how do you know that this is a good model? Is it just that it works, that it transcribes? If I'm coming to Zenodo repository and looking at all these training models, how do I know which ones are good? And perhaps that's self-evident, but if you could just talk a little bit more about that, I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, no, this is a good and important question, and it's not so easy. So there are a few issues around this, I think. One is, again, standards and metadata, so on. So being clear what it was trained on is the most important thing. But even that's not easy. As many of you know, even for Latin script, the questions of terminology for Latin script, for instance, is complicated. So this is part of the idea of HTR United, is that they have the metadata, but also the training data is all there freely available, so you can go and look at it. And yes, you can't go through 1 million images by hand, but at least you can do some samples and see what they use to train it. And I think that is very important. Otherwise, it really is a case of guesswork.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to know also, so what was it trained on? What transcription standards were used? And as we were saying, that's going to be important for you. Did that person use the same abbreviations or not? What Unicode characters did they use to encode different signs? So these are all important questions. So part of what we and others, including HTR United, and there's ACID and other groups as well, it's not just in France by any means, they're trying to work on ways of documenting this as well to help exactly that question. The other approach, if you like, is the automatic model selection, which is something also that we're interested in. So ideally, you shouldn't need to select. The computer should be able to do it for you, at least in terms of what is going to give the best results. What the computer probably cannot do for you is decide which is the best suited to your particular transcription methods. But at least the idea is you give it maybe a sample page and you give it the transcription that you want, and then it can sort of check which model is the closest to that, is the idea, basically. Yeah.
Right. And just one final question. Is there metadata associated or attached to these training models that helps you identify the standards?
So there is some, but again, a lot of these, even if there aren't really standards, it's not so straightforward. So Kraken embeds basic metadata in the model. And then again, part of the idea is that in HTR United, they have metadata and others. And there are initiatives to try to do that more. But it's not so straightforward. And again, it's the way you describe isn't necessarily going to match other people as well.
Yeah. Good, thanks. I see Marina Rustow has a question.
Peter, thank you so much for such a clear exposition of the work that you're doing, and thanks for the work itself. It's a really exciting time to be a philologist. Partly because, philologists are perfectionists by nature. That's kind of like how we're trained. And I think we're going to have to think a little bit differently about the value of perfection. So that's what I wanted to ask you about. I so appreciate your saying that you can do a lot even with 60%, in part because I think as you know, in the project that I'm doing with Geniza fragments, which provide very heterogeneous training data, both in terms of layout and also in terms of handwriting, we're kind of struggling to get our numbers up there. I mean, we certainly cleared 60%, but we haven't necessarily cleared 80% in all cases. So the question that we're struggling with is, at what point do we stop correcting and retraining the model? I think we've sort of come away from the idealistic expectation that we're going to have these like perfect, ready to go transcriptions, and now we see it more as a partnership between the humans and the machine. That what the machine can do is allow us to produce transcriptions with much less cognitive drain because it's doing a lot of the work for us. And I sort of, I like that idea, but I'm curious, for example, about an approach that I think Nachum Dershowitz tried, back in the old days before the current technology was available, that he called word spotting, where you can kind of find words in a manuscript without actually doing a full HDR treatment on the manuscript. Has anyone tried that? With the eScriptorium? I mean, I imagine you'd have to write separate software. So I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on that. And then one other question, if I may, how much would it actually cost to set up and run an instance of eScriptorium that could be used by, like, say, a university community? So, we have maybe like 10 to 15 colleagues now at Princeton who are interested in doing this, but we have absolutely no idea what's involved. Do we need a dedicated admin? Is this just a kind of level of complexity that, we should be prepared for, and a level of expenditure? Like, what are we talking about ballpark wise?
Yeah, good questions without easy answers, of course. So yeah, in terms of word spotting, yes, normally word spotting is an entirely different approach in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. So there are others here in the audience I know who've done word spotting, particularly of Dominique, I think he's still there, and others. So in a sense, if you like word spotting, you have the image, so your input is the text and the output is an image. So it's mapping from the text to the image, whereas HDR is more of the full transcription. So it depends what you want. If your goal is to be able to find, say, I'm interested in this word, I want to be able to find it, and then I can just read the manuscript myself. I'm not worried about a full transcription. Then word spotting might make sense, yes. If you want to actually use the text as such, whether it's for an edition or for linguistic analysis or text identification or whatever, then you would use HDR, so that where the result is the full transcription. So I think, in a sense, your other question about how much accuracy is needed, a lot of it really depends on, again, why you're doing it. And sometimes I wonder that we don't ask ourselves enough, actually, what are we doing this for? And it's very easy to say we're doing this for everybody to be reused and all the rest, but I'm not sure that's possible, and I'm not sure that's helpful either. So my philosophy tends to be, make sure you're very clear why you're doing it, and that will help a lot to decide what you need and when to stop and so on and so forth. So if that at least partly answers the question. The cost is, yes, you asked the same question when we were chatting beforehand, and it's very much how long is a piece of string. I think there are two questions. One is the technical requirements, and the best person to talk to is probably my colleague Ben Kiesling. I don't want to sort of put him on the spot for everyone to contact, but because it does depend so much on how many images you have, how large the images are, how much time you want to spend training, if you can afford to wait for a long time or not, if you need very quick results. We do have colleagues who tried at least running Kraken, if not eScriptorium, just on university clusters, and that can work well. But often those clusters are designed that you submit your batch and you come back a week later and you get your results, which is usually not what most of us in the humanities want. So there's, on the one hand, that, but you're right also that the other significant cost is the maintenance. And this is in the sense of having somebody there, particularly since the reality is that eScriptorium is still in very active development. And so there are regular updates. If you want to try to keep abreast of all that, that means somebody there doing the work and doing the updates and so on. Not necessarily full time. For instance, the instance in Maryland and the one in Paris there's a company that is doing both on a contracted basis. So I'm carefully avoiding giving a clear answer because there are so many different factors. I know that people, for instance, I know of one project where they just bought their own system. It was about 10,000 euros. They set it up and ran themselves, and that was fine for their needs. I'm not sure how many users they have. It's probably not a lot less than 10 to 15 people, but certainly not talking a million manuscripts. The big server in Paris was much, much more than that. It was hundreds of thousands of euros, but that really is designed for very large scale analysis. So I know there is the full range, and some people are able to use university systems, university hardware. My experience has found that has not been so successful, but that can help costs as well. So
Thank
again,
you.
not a clear answer, but I think that helps a bit.
So Jim, who is actually Manu Radhakrishnan, has a question next. Are you there, Manu?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Hello. So I'm actually a little bit surprised at hearing you say that producing editions is not the thing that perhaps we should even be doing. Perhaps I'm misstating what you said, but I'm curious about producing new editions of a text that exists in many, many manuscripts. And the purpose of wanting to digitize all of these is to be able to then categorize them in certain stages that I have already identified, and then to be able to digitize the entire manuscript and see which ones belong to which stage, so that one has a much more finely grained idea of how the text was modified over time. So that would be the purpose for wanting to digitize these. But how would one? Presumably one would. I know I'm talking about the Golden Legend, and I know which chapters I want to test. But would you recommend then that if one did this, that one should scan those chapters, and the first phase would be cataloging each manuscript to say, all right, we can identify 4 stages of composition, and we're going to assign each manuscript based on the scan of one chapter to one of the 4, and then you can say roughly, because the problem with trying to do an edition is if you have variants, then you want to be comparing apples with apples and not apples with oranges. So how would one practically go about doing something like this?
Okay. So, well, first, to be clear, I didn't mean to say that one should not be doing editions. What I'm suggesting was that the doing editions is not the only use, not the only thing that we could be doing. So yes, I certainly do see the value editions. It's not my personal work. I'm more a paleographer than a philologist, but I absolutely do see that. And in fact, for many manuscripts of different states of the same text, this can be very successful, because what one can do, if the texts are sufficiently close, is what I mentioned, but probably wasn't very clear about, with the text image alignment. So the idea here is, if you have a text, or if you have a transcription already, even if it's not for this manuscript, you can do an OCR for HDR that may have more not so accurate results, but is enough to be able to match the two and then use the existing good transcription aligned to the image of the previous manuscript. Then, of course, you would want to go through and correct, because inevitably there will be differences. That's, of course, the whole point of the transcription. So in terms of your question, that sounds like it's going more in the direction of collation perhaps than transcription, if I've understood what you're asking.
No, one would have to first transcribe
Certainly,
in order
yes.
to then categorize and assign to preliminary stages.
Yes.
And only then, once you've then transcribed, say, one chapter from all of the manuscripts, and say you've come up with identified five stages based on a certain criterion, then you would have to collate the others, once you've identified this manuscript belongs to stage 4, but this one belongs to stage 5.
Yes, so exactly. So as you're saying, you would need the transcription, which is the first step, so which could certainly be done with eScriptorium or a similar system, and then corrected.
Mm-hmm.
Because what would help, I guess, is that, as you say, there are different stages, and I would assume that the manuscripts of a given stage will be closer to each other than those of different stages. So
yes.
If one has, as you said, one could transcribe one chapter and then afterwards use the automatic text image alignment, but with a different text depending on the stage. So it would be closer to each manuscript, if that makes sense. So that could be a very good approach. In fact, he suggested to take one chapter, use that to decide which stage it is, and then afterwards to do the text image alignment, where one could be a bit more precise about the text that one is aligning.
Can you, when you say aligning, do you not mean transcribing? I'm not sure that I've understood correctly.
Yes, this probably isn't very clear. So the principle is if one has a manuscript where the OCR works but not very well, say 70%, to pick a number, but where the text is in principle already known. So in your case, you know what the text is. Of course, this manuscript will not be exactly the same.
We know what one stage of the text is.
You know one stage of the text, right? So assuming you already have a transcription of that stage of the text from a different manuscript, the idea is to take the transcription of the different manuscript and match it to your manuscript. And that will normally help, because the assumption, the whole basis of the process is that the text will be close, not identical, but very close. And so then, rather than transcribing the whole manuscript, you will only have to correct line by line any differences between the two. So essentially, it will take a line in the manuscript that you have not transcribed, find the corresponding text in the existing transcription, and put the two together. And so that normally reduces significantly your amount of work, because the only thing you need to do then is just check each line for any variance compared to your base transcription.
Right. Okay, well, thanks very much. I think I'll be in touch by email and not hog any more of your time, because there are other questions. Thanks again.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so I think Ann Matter has been patiently raising her virtual hand for a while. And then after her question, we can move to some questions that are in the chat.
First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. My question is about my personal work. I've worked a lot on glossed Latin manuscripts, especially the Glossa Ordinaria, and I'm very aware of Hebrew manuscripts with a similar kind of layout. And after looking at your example of the Arabic manuscript with text going out at angles, I imagine that the standard kind of picture frame gloss can be translated by the material you use. So my question is, has anybody actually done that? Are there transcriptions of these, especially Latin gloss texts? And if so, are they available to take a look at? Because that would be really interesting to see.
Yes, so the case I know off the top of my head was looking at earlier Carolingian gloss manuscripts. I suspect, I think Dominique or others in the audience may know. I would know who to ask. Off the top of my head, I'm not certain. It's very much the sort of thing that the place to look would be on the HTR United. I suspect those people, they were looking more at medieval French and so on. Off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what they have in the corpus, but that would be where I would start looking at least.
Thank you.
And again, I would not be surprised if others in the audience know of exact examples.
Okay, so in the chat, Toby Burrows has what I think looks like a quick question. Do you know whether anyone has got eScriptorium running on AWS? Which I'm not sure what that is. If
This
you
is
could explain.
the Amazon web service.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm not, I think somebody was looking at it. I'm not sure that anybody's done it. I think to be honest, I'm not particularly familiar with the details of AWS. What I suspect may be an issue, and one of the problems with a lot of cases is because there are normally a lot of images that need to be moved around. If there is not a lot of stored data and fast throughput between the storage and the processor, then it tends to be very slow and bogged down. So in AWS, I honestly don't know if that would be a problem or not, but I can imagine that may be a challenge. But it is all Dockerized, so in principle, I'm sure it could be done. I'm just not sure of the practice.
Okay, and M.A. Johnson is looking for the full citation of Unsworth's article that you mentioned.
Yes, so yeah. There are various different versions of it. If you Google Unsworth and How Not to Read a Million Books, there's a talk he gave, I think it was even at King's back in the day, and there are a couple of sort of blog style online posts. I can look at my bibliography, but usually comes up fairly quickly on Google as well. I think Tanya Clement also contributed and a few other people. Otherwise, I can send them perhaps later to you, Lynn.
Thanks. And Timothy Gollins is riffing on Marina's question. Has there been work of combining the HTR process with information retrieval algorithms? The analogy would be the approaches taken in cross-language information retrieval, where full translation is not necessarily required for the task of finding the information.
Yeah, I'm not aware of cases off the top of my head, but these are the sorts of things I think would be quite interesting to follow up. Yeah.
Okay. Moving right along, Brian Cardell asks, how effective has the software been in transcribing very heavily abbreviated Latin manuscripts? For example, early 13th century scholastic texts, where linguistic context can be very important to determine accurate transcription of seemingly similar abbreviations.
Yeah, so this is one of the big questions, and in a sense, there are two approaches. If the abbreviations are not linguistically determined, if they're visually determined, then one can train it to expand abbreviations automatically. As you say, in many cases, this is not the case. And it's important also to emphasize that at least in eScriptorium, this is not a language model. So there is no knowledge of the language as such. Now, there are other systems where this is done and this significantly improves the results. The issue for us, again, is we can't possibly have language models for Old Tocharian and Old Vietnamese and everything else. So what some people have done is tried to, well, train the machine to actually transcribe the abbreviations as abbreviations. And then in a later stage, used large language models, even ChatGPT, some people have got pretty good results actually. So the eScriptorium itself just transcribes the sign, abbreviation sign. And then in a second stage, you added language information to expand the abbreviations. And so generally, those are the two options.
Right. I think one more question. How does eScriptorium signal it has encountered a character or equivalent that it doesn't recognize from? Wait, did I just ask that one?
No, there's so
So
yeah,
I'm losing
that's
track.
that is an important question. So the whole principle of machine learning is that it has to know in advance all possible characters. So if it encounters a character it doesn't know, it either will ignore it or it will try to fit it to a character that it thinks it does know, essentially. So there is an uncertainty system, so you can visualize it so that it will color code the characters where it is less certain. But in principle, it will essentially try to guess, which can be a problem, yes. So this comes back to the question of model choice. You need the model that has the characters that you want in your transcription. And yes, it's possible to add characters, but of course you have to know that in order to do so and train it accordingly.
And I think there's one more question that's sort of related to it. Do your algorithms handle unclear text and provide smart suggestions, predictions for what it could be from surrounding text? So is that sort of highlighting that you were just mentioned part of that?
Yeah, so it, as I mentioned before, there's no language model. So if there's really no information, it can't predict. Having said that, there's no language model as such, but in a sense there is, because it does look at the whole line. So if, for instance, at the end of a word, there's a U with maybe something strange above it in Latin, very often it will actually correctly guess that it's a UM or something like that. But it's not really doing that as such. So yes, we've looked at things like just, and this partly goes back to the previous question actually, training it so that if it comes across something, I don't know, an erasure or a strike through or something, just putting in a $sign or something that would never occur in the text. And sometimes you can train it to do that. So then you can search for a dollar or whatever it is and come back and do it that way. But it doesn't actively propose text as such, because again, there isn't a language model. But there was a conference last week where people were talking about exactly that, in using LLMs, GPT, that sort of thing, for at least a few characters and getting pretty good results. But that's a separate process. Yeah.
Great. Are there any more questions? I think that's it from the chat, and I don't see any hands raised. Well, Timothy Gollins has just raised his hand. Would you like to have the last question?
Thank you. That's very kind. Really interesting talk. Unfortunately, I missed early parts of it because of something else that was going on in my world. So it's possible that this is a null question. I'm really interested in this idea of there being no language model, and I'm wondering. And you mentioned the idea of taking the output and then pushing that through a language model to start doing other things. You also mentioned that the output has how much of the output do you have in terms of uncertainty? So you mentioned, I can see on the user interface, you might have color coding, but in terms of behind the scenes, do you have confidence values for each element that you're pulling out? And is that part of the data structure that comes out internally?
Yeah, we've been discussing this actually because it is an interesting, potentially important question. And I mean, in principle, yes and no. So there is that it's not in eScriptorium, but in Kraken within eScriptorium. So
Right.
if you want to work at that level, you would want to work directly with Kraken, but that's entirely feasible. Where it gets a little bit difficult is if you want to know specific characters and particularly the different options for a specific character.
Right.
Because of the way the lines are encoded, that turns out to be not very straightforward. So again, if you're interested in that, the best would be to contact Ben Kisling directly. My colleague who's responsible for Kraken. But yeah, so the answer is sort of, but it's not as easy as one might hope. Let's say that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. It's that data would be what you would need to do the to do something clever with the information retrieval piece that I asked about before, is understanding the uncertainty. You can then fold those uncertainties together with the uncertainty of the search string, and start to do some smart things there, or at least in principle you could. I mean,
yeah, that would be interesting. Be interesting to filter then and to understand the structures.
Yeah, you kind of, it's almost naively you think you have to know exactly what you've got before you can find it. In reality, you don't.
Yeah,
is kind of is where that comes from. But thank you. That very fascinating talk.
Well, thank you again, Peter, and to everybody who attended. This has been a really stimulating lecture. I think we all have to get off of the Zoom meeting so that we can write our administrators asking if we can look into trying to get an instance of this. Yeah, it's been really illuminating, and your presentation of what is a very complicated software and topic, I think for many of us was great. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And then again, as I said, stay tuned. Keep your eyes out for the next spring's lineup, and we look forward to seeing you then. Happy holidays and Happy New Year. Thanks, everyone.